Good afternoon to you. What sanctions is the British government imposing on Russia?
Stephen, yesterday Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, outlined the latest tranche of sanctions that Britain will impose on Russia. This comes after the initial round earlier in the week and after those troops rolled across the Ukrainian border and started to approach Kiev. Prime Minister Johnson said these measures go much further. They target all Russian banks, so all of those banks based in Russia will not be able to access sterling, pound sterling. They will not be able to access clearing houses here in Britain. So the assets of big banks like VTB, Bank have also been frozen here. There are a range of other measures as well. The airline Aeroflot, Russia's national airline, has been banned from landing in the UK. And as you mentioned, Russia has taken reciprocal measures in banning British Airways from its entire airspace. Britain has also banned the issuing of dual-use licenses. These are for export items that can be used for both civilian and military measures. They have banned the export of oil refinery products to Russia as well. So overall, they say that this package will erode the Russian economy. Now, the big question here is time. Of course, the Ukrainians, as the Russian troops bear down on Kiev, don't have that time. These sanctions will take time to work, and Russia has a war chest of something like $650 billion worth of gold and foreign reserves to call upon. So it's unlikely, analysts say, that these sanctions will stop President Putin continuing his military operation anytime soon.
So it would seem they're not going to have a big material impact on the Russian economy in the short term. Do people in Britain feel this is the right thing? Has there been a big reaction to this package? I've seen some commentary suggesting that the sanctions may be a little bit weak, but I don't know what other options the British government has.
Their options are limited, short of sending in troops into Ukraine, and that's something that the British Defence Minister and other NATO leaders have explicitly ruled out. Any contact between NATO troops and Russian troops is not on the table. So the only leverage the West has is economical means at the moment. Now, they're targeting the people closest to President Putin, those oligarchs who prop up the Russian economy, who prop up President Putin in the Kremlin. And the UK widened its targeting to some 100 individuals in the past week to try to get leverage on Russia. And Western allies in NATO and beyond, so let's not forget other allies in Japan, in Australia, and also British ministers in contact with allies in South Africa and India and other countries as well, trying to get coordination of these economic measures, a global condemnation of Russia, and measures that are coordinated. It's no good if you sanction one particular bank in London, but that bank is able to raise money or have its assets liquid in New York or in Paris or in Tokyo. So a global response to this is key for the West, and they do think that that is the only leverage they have over Moscow. But it is difficult. Without any military options on the table for NATO, the odds for Ukraine of holding out looks slim at this time.
There's also a sort of symbol of this, particularly in London, of what are often described as Russian oligarchs, very rich people who come from Russia. In some cases, they've bought up certain places in London and certain homes. In some cases, they've bought up certain football clubs. They're a big public symbol of Russia's presence in terms of economic presence in London itself.
They certainly are. Some people describe it as Londongrad because of its deep Russian connections. The British capital provides everything that a Russian oligarch needs to invest wealth, to hide it if necessary, and all the legal processes, the insurance, the property market, where they can hold their wealth in a safe environment, where they can send their children to private schools, where they can holiday in the south of France or go skiing in the Alps in luxury, and those assets up till now have been safe. And there have been calls, not just in the past few weeks as Russia has built its forces on the borders of Ukraine, but for many years, decades now, for Britain to crack down on the number of Russian elites, possibly with corrupt money, who are investing their money in London. You go back to 2004 and the murder, the poisoning of dissident Alexander Litvinenko in London. You go to the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008, the invasion of Crimea in 2014, the Salisbury poisonings a few years later. And these calls have got louder and louder, and yet the British government has done really not much to try to stop this corrupt money coming into the country. And so now those calls are growing much louder. The government is promising to crack down on it and to use it as leverage over Russia. Whether it works, time will tell.
This comes also at a tricky time for the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. He's been under intense political pressure over what's often called Partygate. Now there's a big foreign crisis. Does this weaken him, strengthen him? Is it just put everything else domestic politics-wise on pause in the UK?
I think the latter. I think, all the attention here in London has been on that Partygate scandal, on Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party's fortunes. But I guess, the return of conflict to Europe on this scale for the first time really since 1945. Of course, there have been other conflicts in the Balkans and elsewhere, but nothing like this since the end of the Second World War, really, in terms of this level of armour crossing the border of a democratic country. And so that does rather, I suppose, put things in perspective for many people around Europe. But nevertheless, the perils aren't over for Boris Johnson. He is still under police investigation for those alleged parties that he attended and held in number 10 Downing Street and elsewhere. And that police report is due to be made public, we understand, in the coming weeks. And that remains a moment of danger for the Prime Minister. I think politically this does provide some relief, some distraction. It gives him a chance to look statesmanlike, and most European allies and most political analysts you speak to here, I think, say he has stood up well to the task. In the past week, he has described this conflict between Russia and Ukraine as really a war between East and West, and says it's one that the West must win and that Putin must lose, because the implications of this conflict go far wider than the future for Ukraine itself. So yes, difficult times still politically for Boris Johnson, but for the moment, attention is elsewhere and very much focused on the war in Ukraine.
It's been very interesting to see how people in different countries have reacted to this invasion. In South Africa, there's a big debate around should South Africa take a side, should South Africa remain neutral. Our government's official position has been to call on Russia to withdraw its forces. In Britain, I suspect that many memories, even though it happened so long ago, are around the Second World War, the idea of people being forcibly conscripted in Ukraine to fight against the Russian army. Is there a sense of shock in the UK?
Huge shock. The memories are long, and there are people within living memory and people whose grandfathers would have fought in that conflict, and to have a conflict where it's being compared to 1938 or 1939, to the Germans' invasion of the Sudetenland, for example, and many people are drawing parallels to that and saying, look, this is the moment where Britain and the West need to intervene. Look what happened in 1938 and 1939. We allowed Nazi Germany to expand into Czechoslovakia, into Poland and so on before any wider conflict took place. And by that time, it was too late. The message there is, look, Russia has already expanded into Georgia, South Ossetia. It's expanded into Crimea. Now it's seemingly going to invade the entirety of Ukraine. Do you really think that President Putin is going to stop there? So goes the argument. What about those Baltic states that are now members of NATO, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania? They have reinforcements of NATO allies in their territories, but they number in the single thousands, whereas there are something like 200,000 Russian troops heading west across Ukraine. Strikes have taken place in airports close to the Polish border, close to where United States troops, a couple of 100 kilometers from where US troops are stationed, reinforcing NATO's eastern flank. So, yes, there is huge shock here. In 1991, at the collapse of the Soviet Union, people thought that that Western ideology of freedom, democracy, and the rule of law had won, and Europe and the West have existed on that assumption, have grown prosperous on that assumption for the past 3 decades, and perhaps have grown less aware and ignorant of the risk that a strengthening Russia has posed. Europe has paid tens of billions of dollars every year for Russian gas and oil, and it's still doing so. The sanctions that were imposed by Britain and Europe over the past couple of days don't include the Russian energy sector. So those energy resources are still flowing from Russia to Europe. European euros and pounds are still heading east into Moscow's coffers. And yet Russia grows stronger and stronger, has invested heavily in its military, and the outcome of that is what we're seeing now in Ukraine.
Henry Ridgwell, thank you, the London correspondent for Voice of America. I do appreciate the time.